it was people put on a mid versus a high fat diet in which they had people eat more than 4 servings of dairy per day. Should be hard to do. I love dairy, but it would be hard for me to get 4 servings. But and it was a crossover trial. So they did a low dairy fat and then a high dairy fat. And then they crossed over, had a washout period to cross over to the other. And what that study showed was that specifically as C15 increased on the high dairy fat diet, that there was a decrease in arterial stiffness, which is really interesting. And this is within 12 weeks. It didn't follow like C16 or the amount of fat, dairy fat they ate. It was specifically tied to increases in C15, lowered vascular stiffness, which may help explain why we see these heart health benefits as well as the lower LDL cholesterol.
Hello, Dr. Venn-Watson. So you are a co-founder and the CEO of Seraphina Therapeutics, which is a health and wellness company focused on C15, on bringing C15, a newly discovered essential nutrient, to the world. So you're also the author of a recently published book, The Longevity Nutrient. So welcome back to Modern Healthspan, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, Richard, it's wonderful, wonderful to be here with you.
So Dr. Venn-Watson, we did talk, it was about 9 months ago, I think 9, 10 months ago. So there were some things that we covered, and I've linked to that above. But let's start with the review of C15 and starting at the beginning. So what is C15?
Yep, absolutely. So C15 is the first emerging essential fatty acid to be found in over 90 years, right? We shared that in the last chat since omega-3 and omega-6 back in 1929 and 1930. It is an odd chain saturated fatty acid. So it has an odd number of carbons, 15, and it's a saturated fat, which means it has no double bonds in its structure, making it remarkably stable and resistant to lipid peroxidation. A big role of C15 with regard to our health and longevity.
The fact that it's a saturated fat gives it certain properties in when it's supporting cell walls. So why are saturated fats kind of better? What is the outcome of that in terms of cell stability?
Right. I mean, so we've learned for so long, right, Richard, that all saturated fats are bad and avoid all of them. And we're starting to learn that's not, not all saturated fats are created equal. And maybe even a lot of the bad things we're saying about saturated fats may not be as bad as we had originally thought. But we're learning a lot about saturated fats. We're learning that the odd chain saturated fats, especially C15, really being the Goldilocks fatty acid, has multiple properties that are beneficial, anti-inflammatory. We'll talk through a lot of the different mechanisms that it has, especially related to brain health and allergies and things like that. But the fact that just by the nature of being a saturated fat, again, that it has no double bonds, it means it's not susceptible to attack by oxygen. So as such, it goes into our cell membranes, strengthens the cell wall of our cells, and effectively and very simply and elegantly helps to protect our cells against age-related breakdown. I think we might have talked about what's called the cell membrane pacemaker theory of aging from A.J. Holbert, which he showed that back in 2005, that the more stable the fatty acids in the cell membrane, aka the more saturated the fats in cell membranes, the lower the levels of lipid peroxidation and the longer a mammalian species lived. And so what A.J. Holbert showed was that the more stable we can make our fatty acids in our cell membrane, helped explain how humans and dolphins and elephants live longer than mice. Longevity's evolution's already figured out a longevity, and so we keep focusing on how to help mice live longer. But I think the real question is, how did evolution help us live longer than mice in the first place? And this is a really nice theory that C15 fits right in.
So C15 is an odd chain fatty acid, right? But and so there are other saturated fatty. So what is the difference between even and odd chain fatty acids? Why do even chains seem to be beneficial where sorry, odd chains appear to be beneficial, whereas even chains are not?
Yeah, this is shocking, right? Because it's just we're talking about one carbon differences and it's skipping. So odds are in general associated with better health, directly showed to have anti-inflammatory and other benefits. Meanwhile, even chain saturated fatty acids, especially C16, C18, are continually associated with an increased risk of type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, heart disease, the opposite of the odds. And it is in the dish, it is a pro-inflammatory saturated fatty acid. And so the big question is, well, how? And so what we now know is that in general, when we metabolize these saturated fats, they always break down by two carbons at a time. So an odd chain fatty acid essentially always stays odd. It goes 15, 13, 9, 11, 9, and it in the end it becomes C3, which is propionic acid, which again is an anti-diabetic, anti-inflammatory molecule. Meanwhile, the even chains break down and they stay evens, right? Two carbons at a time, C16, 14, 12, and so on, down to acetoacetic acid, which is a pro-diabetic, pro-inflammatory molecule. So once their numbers of chains are set, Richard, they're kind of their fate is set, and of whether they're going to be what we'll put in quotes a good versus a bad saturated fat.
So C15 is an essential fatty acid. So why do you say that? What are the properties that an essential fatty acid has to have?
Right. It's a great question. So C15, when we first discovered C15's associations, its ability, the higher the levels of C15, specifically we were looking in dolphins, right? The higher levels of C15, the better that predicted that that dolphin was going to be a healthy aging dolphin, less likely to get chronic inflammation, high cholesterol, insulin resistance, fatty liver disease, and Alzheimer's. So we then went to understand move C15 into the lab. We did 8 studies over 3 years in collaboration with Dr. Ed Dennis, who's a leader in fatty acids. He was the editor-in-chief for the Journal for Lipid Research for 15 years. And through those 8 studies, we sought to understand its mechanism of action, its cell-based efficacy, its in vivo efficacy, and then epidemiological studies. And in those studies, we included all the other saturated fats, right? So either whether they were even or odd, C 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. And what we found was that C15 specifically met the criteria of an essential fatty acid, where no other saturated fat did. So when we talk about an essential fatty acid, this is a nutrient or a compound, a molecule that our bodies must have in order to maintain baseline physiological health. And if we don't have enough of it, then our physiological function declines. The reason what makes it essential is that our bodies can't make enough of it to keep to those healthy levels. That means we have to get certain amounts from our diet. When we worked through the process of looking at all the different saturated fats, ones fell out. So all the evens automatically fell out because they were actually pro-inflammatory, increased risk of the diseases. So those aren't going to be essential fatty acids, and our bodies can make these even chain saturated fats as well. When we got down to really 15 and 17, we showed that our bodies can actually make C17 and can make adequate levels in part by our body uses C15 to make C17. And in addition, in vivo studies, C17 did okay. It decreased inflammation, but it didn't have the breadth of benefits that C15 did. And so once we looked at it really just narrowed down to C15 was the only saturated fat that in which there were critical levels that we needed to prevent cells from becoming fragile, falling apart. It had these dose-dependent anti-inflammatory, lowered 18 pro-inflammatory cytokines. activated things like PPAR alpha delta. Our bodies don't make enough of it. It makes some of it, but not enough to reach those levels. And in the absence of it, as we published last year, there's evidence of a C15 deficiency called cellular fragility syndrome. So when you check off all those boxes, that led to our first paper where we put the stake, that really bold stake in the ground, saying this is looking like it's meeting the criteria of an essential fatty acid. Most importantly, since we last talked, there have been 4 studies that have been published by 3 different independent teams from Canada, France, and China who have all then gone and redone gold standard studies for essential fatty acids. These are ones that the same studies that were used by George and Mildred Burr back in 1929 and 1930 to discover the first 2 essential fatty acids, ALA and LA. They repeated those same studies, Richard, using C15, and they found that indeed C15 meets those same criteria of an essential fatty acid. So multiple groups now were put it to the test skeptically and said, well, gosh, in the end, if you take C15 away from the diet of a neonatal mouse, that mouse develops a nutritional deficiency. And when you put it back, when you give that neonate C15 again, the deficiency goes away and it becomes a healthy mouse. So again, these kind of gold standard studies that have helped define essential fatty acids. Really exciting that the dolphins, right, led to this unlock and crazy that it's taken 90 years, and some advanced technologies to get there.
Yes, it's always interesting to me that the dolphins get the same kind of diseases that we get. Um, I always thought that those were like diseases of um, civilization, of being sedentary, but dolphins get the same thing. I mean, it's a kind of a diversion, but I'm just kind of amazed at that.
I, Richard, I'm going to tell you you're right. So, and that's because Navy, right? We specifically were looking at Navy dolphins, which get a lot older than dolphins in the wild, right? So we talk about dolphins in the wild live to 20. Dolphins in the Navy are routinely living into their 40s and 50s, with 2 dolphins turning 60 this year. It's because they basically had access to healthcare, right? Available food. They basically were, the Navy created the equivalent of a developed country for them. And they were given a civilized environment in which they were allowed to get old enough to get aging related conditions. So I'm going to go with your belief. It just, the dolphins found a way to get there
With a little help. Yes.
with a little help. Yeah.
Okay, so it is essential. So we need to get it from our diet. So I guess, how much do we need on a kind of daily basis, and how much should there be in the body? I mean, how do we measure that we have sufficient?
Right. So here's the great news, right? So there have been lots and lots of huge prospective cohort studies in which they measured C15 as part of routine, fatty acid panels. Back in the day, it was being measured and no one cared about it. But when big studies in groups like Harvard and others, Cambridge and others, have been able to go back into these huge databases and be like, oh my gosh, we've collected data on C15. So we can now run and do these data analyses of, from populations, tens of thousands of people tracked for over decades. The other component is that C15 has been measured specifically as a biomarker of how much dairy fat we eat. So no one thought C15 had any beneficial properties, but it was well understood that the more whole dairy fat that one eats, the higher their C15 levels. Again, a criteria of an essential fatty acid, that our levels are driven by how much we eat. So we were given this gift of readily available data across populations for a nutrient that's in food that most people have to some exposure. And so that allowed these rapid publication of many meta-analyses, large prospective cohort studies, and multiples of them, in which all of these studies consistently show that people with higher C15 levels have a lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, heart disease, including coronary heart disease, hypertension, and heart failure. So all of a sudden, with this unlock with the dolphins, we just saw this blossoming of human data coming out, being able to show that. So that gets me a long way to get to the answer of your question, which is because we have all that data, we now know what humans are typically have and what they're supposed to have. So most studies measure C15 as a percentage of fatty acids among total fatty acids in the blood. So they'll be reported as a percent. We know that we need at least 0.2% of total fatty acids in our cell membranes to be C15 in order to keep that cell membrane stable. If we go below 0.2%, cell membranes become less stable. It increases the risk of this new form of cell death called ferroptosis, right, which was discovered by research at Columbia University back in 2012. On the flip side, we know that if we can get more in the area of 0.4 to 0.6%. Populations like Sardinia in the high longevity zone, they have C15 levels that are 0.6, 2 to 3, 3 times higher than the average population. This group has a lower risk of dying. They are living longer because they have a lower risk of dying from heart disease. And then there's another study by Harvard showing if you have, as you increase your C15 levels from 0.2 to 0.55 to 0.6, it has a linear decrease in your risk of developing cardiovascular disease. So it's, being able to look at the same outcome, different studies, different approaches, all supporting that we need this, greater than 0.2% C15 in our blood.
We're constantly surrounded by invisible signals, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, 5G, and we rarely consider their impact on our bodies. Some researchers suggest these signals can open channels in our cells, letting in excess calcium. Too much calcium triggers stress and disrupts your balance. Magnesium helps keep these channels in check. It's your body's natural way to stay calm and steady. But when you're exposed to EMFs, you burn through magnesium faster, and most people are already deficient. Many magnesium supplements use just one or two forms your body can't absorb well. That's why I take Magnesium Breakthrough by BiOptimizers. It's the formula with all 7 essential forms. It helps me sleep better and stay calm and focused. Go to bioptimizers.com/modern and use code MODERN10 to save 15%. They offer a full 365-day money-back guarantee. And if you subscribe, you'll get great discounts, free gifts, and a guaranteed monthly supply. And it's measuring the percentage of C15 in red blood cell walls, or I guess red and white blood cell walls.
Yeah, mostly the most common one is called the erythrocyte membrane, C15 levels. And it's equal to, for people who are familiar with things like measuring glucose versus HbA1c, that HbA1c is a more stable measurement of glucose levels, right? So this is the same case for C15 and other fatty acids. If you measure fatty acids in the erythrocyte, the red blood cell membrane, it's a much more stable look at what your C15 levels actually are. There are tests that routinely test it in the blood, the serum or the plasma, but it can go up and down and have more variation compared to looking at that cell membrane.
Yeah, that would make sense. So why is this becoming more of an issue now? Why is it kind of coming to the fore?
Right. So for dolphins, we had a coinciding deficiency issue between the dolphins and the humans. And so the dolphins started seeing lower C15 levels around the early 2000s because prior to that, their primary fish type was eulachon, which is a really fatty fish that was along the northwestern coast. That fishery died out. And so when that fishery died out, the Navy had to move to less fatty fish. And so it was a combination of 5 different types of fish. 2 out of 5 of those had no C15 in it. So all of a sudden, the dolphins had less access to high C15 fish. And we saw over a period of 10 to 20 years, the emergence of things like fatty liver disease, that we had never seen before, and insulin resistance start coming in because their C15 levels were getting lower. In the meantime, for humans, our primary source of C15 is dairy fat, right? And so what started happening in 1977, Congress here in the US had released dietary recommendations for all Americans, men, women, and children shall stop taking their intake of all saturated fats. And so that resulted in people moving to non-fat milks, plant-based milks, from butter to margarine. And as they moved away from these food sources, not only did they decrease their intake of even chain, but they also decreased their intake of odd chain saturated fatty acids, including C15. So now we have populations born since the 1990s, especially in the 1990s, pediatricians then doubled down and said, if once your child turns 2 years old, they need to move off whole fat milk. And so we really have generations born since the 1990s that have come into a relatively C15 deficient world, unless you didn't listen to your doctor. And then a lot of moms are like, I didn't listen to the doctor. My kid got whole fat milk, because that's what I thought he or she should get.
Is it easy to still buy whole fat milk? I don't buy milk.
Yeah, it is. It is. Absolutely. The added issue with milk, there are a couple. One is that we're now learning that not all dairy fat, milk fat's the same. That if a cow is fed grass, it has twice as much C15 than if it's fed corn. And when I buy my milk, I don't know what that cow was fed. So we are pushing for the dairy industry to report, include in their, ingredient profile, what levels of C15 do you have? Because I'll buy the milk that has the higher C15. We're going to drive that. We're going to create a market for for them where I'll choose the higher C15 butter or fat. So there's some more recent studies that I've been surprised in which they report the fatty acid profile, even of whole fat milk. And I've been surprised that in some cases it's remarkably lower than the same study that would have been done 10 years ago. So quality of C15 in dairy fats changing. And the other is that if you look at milk fat, only 1% of milk fat is C15. Over 40% of milk fat are these pro-inflammatory even chain saturated fats, which explains why if you give a mouse pure C15, like a obese mouse model of diabetes, you give it pure C15, it gets lower glucose, lower inflammation, lower cholesterol. If you give that same mouse model dairy fat, just milk fat, it gets worse. Higher liver fat, higher liver inflammation. So that's why the Navy funded us to challenge us and said, can you create a pure vegan friendly, free fatty acid bioavailable C15 ingredient that could work on its own without having to compete with all these other fats in food? Basically, can you make a C15 that's more effective than food?
Interesting. For the dolphins in the Navy, did you fix it by switching the fish or did you fix it by supplementing them?
We fixed it by changing the fish. And so our initial studies were, let's go find high C15 fish. And we found some in the Gulf of Mexico, specifically mullet and pinfish. But the pinfish have pins on them. So they're like, they have a name for a reason. So those weren't ideal from our poor handlers' point of view as they were preparing the fish. But mullet ended up being a great fish, even for in humans, in studies of mullet as a food for humans, has high C15 levels in it. So we were able to fix it. The issue that the Navy ran into is it's hard for them to find enough fish that have high enough C15 levels. As waters have gotten warmer and other things have been changing, fish have less fat than they used to. They're smaller than they used to be. The abundance is still the same, but the fish has changed, and so it's getting harder to find fish to have the same C15 levels they used to. So the Navy dolphins are getting supplemented. They get fatty 15 in their diet.
Okay, so there have been so there was these observational trials that kind of going back and looking at the data, but there's also been some RCTs where you've looked
Mhm.
at some of the diseases. So could you talk a little bit about fatty liver disease and C15?
Yeah, so this has been like really interesting, right? So dolphins were developing fatty liver disease. And that we published that paper in 2012 in the Journal of Wildlife Diseases. So not like a highly read journal in the medical world, but it was a big deal for us back in the day. And Dr. Jeff Schwimmer, who is the leading pediatric expert in fatty liver disease in kids, he was scanning the literature for anything on fatty liver disease, and our paper popped up on his computer, on his desktop. And so he reached out and he said, "You're saying dolphins have fatty liver disease, but I don't, it's probably not the same as what we're talking about. So send me samples of dolphin livers and let me take a peek." And so we sent it to him, and I'll never forget his response, right? It was his email came back a couple weeks later, and he said, "We are a go." He's like, "This is fascinating. The dolphin livers, the tissue under the microscope looks exactly like his pediatric patients with fatty liver disease. Like, what is going on? Because we're pursuing sugar as being the cause of fatty liver disease in kids. Dolphins don't eat sugar. So I want to know what's happening." So that's where over the past 10 years, we've actually been working in parallel with Dr. Jeff Schwimmer and understanding. The leading hypothesis is that C15 deficiencies, right, which were coinciding in both dolphins and humans at the same time, C15 deficiencies are a driver for fatty liver disease, right? Non-alcoholic, or MASLD, as it's now called, didn't exist before 1980. The first cases were identified at Mayo Clinic in the first 30 cases, and then now it's present in up to 38% of people globally. So where did this come from? And one of our hypotheses is that it's C15 deficiencies driving the cause of fatty liver disease. So Jeff did a study showing, his initial study was looking at C15 levels and liver fat in 200 or 300, 2 to 300 kids. And he showed indeed that the higher the C15 levels in the plasma, the lower, it was inversely related, right? The lower the liver fat in the kids. So then that inspired him then to move forward with a clinical trial. So he did a randomized, placebo-controlled, double-blinded clinical trial in 18 to 24-year-olds who had a history of fatty liver disease. And they got C15 supplementation for 12 weeks. And this study was really a home run for us out of the gate, um, primarily for a few things. First, there were 30 participants in the study, and 2 out of 3 of the participants in the study had what we had defined as C15 deficiency. So less than, instead of 0.2%, I'm going to move to concentration, less than 5 micrograms per mil. So that was already a a huge, but like you have a population of this, we're saying 1 in 3 people are deficient. This was 2 out of 3 met the criteria of deficiency. The second was that among the group that went on the supplement, half of them adhered to the protocol, because we are talking about 18 to 24-year-olds. Jeff is like, this is the not the ideal group from a clinical trial perspective, because their parents aren't giving them the intervention and they're still young. So about half of them adhered well to the protocol. And of those, among those, they saw exactly what we'd expect. They took 200 milligrams of C15. Their C15 levels went up by 2 micrograms per mil, exactly as had been predicted by prior extensive pharmacokinetic studies in humans. And of those that got up and above 5 micrograms per mil, Richard, they saw a significant decrease in ALT and AST, these liver enzymes that show there was an improvement in liver function. They also had an improvement in hemoglobin, again, speaking to this like strengthening of the cell membranes in the red blood cells. And these are in 18 not older people, 18 to 24-year-olds. So it was really we were able to check off a lot of proof points in just that initial relatively small scale clinical trial. So fatty liver, so that the hypothesis is still holding. There's no studies that have um, disproven the hypothesis. So Jeff continues to move forward, as do we, on if we could address this condition right now present in more than 1 in 3 people globally by restoring C15 levels. Goodness, let's go do that.
Yes, and it does seem, I mean, like fatty liver disease, as you said, started in the 1980s. It was not known before then. And it must be nutritional, right? I
Right.
mean, it's not
Yeah,
infectious, right?
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And the same thing, we tracked, follow that same logic with the dolphins of just figuring out why were dolphins getting fatty liver disease all of a sudden? Not all of a sudden, but over over a period of a decade or two. And it really got us down to C15 deficiency. And initially we, determined it was being caused by ferroptosis. We just didn't know it had the name, but we were seeing this iron deposition and cell-related cell death in the liver. We just didn't know that Columbia University had named this form of cell death. What we did figure out is it was fixable by just getting C15 back in their diet.
Have you done any, or have there been any randomized trials on kind of insulin resistance and diabetes with C15?
There've been a lot of it. There's been a lot of exciting movement on clinical trials. The nice thing is that, it's been 10 years since that initial discovery in dolphins. So this has really given time for the world, the research world to work on C15, and they are, thank goodness. So not only have we been able to have the world revalidate C15 as an essential fatty acid, Abbas et al. Just did a study reconfirming C15's ability to stop and reverse ferroptosis and its impact on the liver in a second model. With regard to clinical trials, there was the one that I just described. There was a second one that was done in Singapore, and this is with women who had a high BMI and same have the history of fatty liver disease. And that study showed that C15, in addition to lowering liver enzymes and liver fat, which is a little bit complicated because the different study groups, the first two study groups involved women who had low hypocaloric diet, like between 1,000 to 1,500 calories a day, which would be really hard and not enjoyable and not sustainable, but it will get you to lose weight and that will help with fatty liver disease. So that was the first group. The second group had low calories and they followed a Mediterranean aligned diet. Mediterranean diet has also been shown to be beneficial for fatty liver disease. And then the third group was low calorie Mediterranean diet aligned plus C15 supplementation. So this was a really heavy lift to ask of C15 to go do better than weight loss and a Mediterranean diet within 12 weeks. And what that study showed was in addition to the benefits from the weight loss, it had trend wise the greatest decreases in liver enzymes, the greatest decreases in liver fat, not statistically significant, just trend wise, but there was a significant decrease in LDL cholesterol, as well as an increased growth of Bifidobacterium adolescentis. So a good mama microbe that, many understand that this is a really important microbe for gut as well as metabolic health. So that was that study. They just released a post hoc analysis in the same group of women, and they showed that the C15 treated or C15 supplemented group had the greatest decrease in anxiety. And, I think we'll talk about a bit about mental health, but that was a fun study to see. There are, there's one more study to share, two more studies to share, one more clinical trial, where it was people put on a mid versus a high fat diet in which they had people eat more than 4 servings of dairy per day. Should be hard to do. I love dairy, but it would be hard for me to get 4 servings. But and it was a crossover trial. So they did a low dairy fat and then a high dairy fat. And then they crossed over, had a washout period to cross over to the other. And what that study showed that specifically as C15 increased on the high dairy fat diet, that there was a decrease in arterial stiffness, which is really interesting. And this is within 12 weeks. It didn't follow like C16 or the amount of fat, dairy fat they ate. It was specifically tied to increases in C15, lowered vascular stiffness, which may help explain why we see these heart health benefits as well as the lower LDL cholesterol. And then there was a new study published in that looked at an algal oil that was high in C15 and oral intake of that. This was a randomized placebo-controlled clinical trial. This was about skin health and showed that women who at the average age of 50 years old who increased their C15 through this product, this supplement, had better increased collagen, better water retention within their skin, so not so dry, and improved, just overall improved skin health. So it's exciting to see how these clinical trials come out. And we just sit and wait for them to wait for them to get published and see what's the next delight and surprise out there.
Yeah, it's a pity that there weren't more C15 trials, but people just earlier, like, but just, people just
Yeah,
weren't looking at it, right? It just
that's
wasn't
right.
on the
That's right.
radar. Okay, so let's talk about the anxiety, actually. So C15, so there was a trial with C15 and mental health, but you also looked at some of the mechanisms by which C15 would help you kind of fend off depression. So can you talk about that trial and kind of what the mechanism is you think is at work?
Right. So there are a few things here. The first is when we were first evaluating C15's cell-based efficacy. So this is using biomap, which is 12 human cell systems mimicking various disease states, 145 different biomarkers tested at 4 different concentrations. So this is a standard screening assay for that the pharmaceutical company uses in order to screen a molecule for potential benefits as well as safety. So when we ran C15 through that, we learned a lot of things. The book covers, there's a lot of talk about this biomap because it really was incredibly effective at saying we think C15 is going to do this, X, Y, or Z. And then once it moved into in vivo studies in humans, it continues to pan out over and over again. So this initial study showed that C15 at lower concentrations had mimicked the activities of bupropion, which is one of the leading antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications that are being used out there. So that was curious because that wasn't an expected outcome, right, from C15. It has different behaviors at different concentrations. And we're learning in this lower, it not only mimicked bupropion, but it also mimicked cannabinoids, specifically THC. And so that was kind of a first hint that C15 not only plays a role with regard to metabolic, heart, liver, and red blood cell health, but that it may be tapping into things that are important with regard to our mental health. So then from there, I'll skip forward to the most recent study, and then we'll talk about this fun metabolite of C15. But C15 itself, we've learned, and we just published in April, that we ran C15 against a bunch of mechanisms of action, receptors that are targets for neuroprotective activities. And in that, and it's in part because we're seeing Alzheimer's in some older dolphins. And so there's a desire to say, does C15 have neuroprotective activities specific to Alzheimer's? And what we found was out of 39 different targets that we tested C15 for, that 2 popped out as really exciting, in which there was a classic dose response curve. The first was that C15 inhibited FAAH, which is fatty acid amide hydrolase. And this enzyme chews up endocannabinoids. So we want to keep our endocannabinoids up and going because those are our blissful molecules that tap into activate CB1 and CB2 receptors responsible for good sleep, calm mood, less pain. And so the pharma industry has been hot on finding pharmaceutical molecules that can inhibit FAAH, this enzyme that chews up our endocannabinoids. It ends up C15 has this activity at levels that are equal to the gold standard, the positive control for this activity. The second is that C15 is a MAO-B inhibitor, and this MAO-B is an enzyme that chews up dopamine. And as we get older, both our endocannabinoid and dopamine levels drop, in part because FAH and MA and MAO-B levels increase. So if we want to take care of aging-related changes, decreasing MAO-B, inhibiting MAO-B helps then support healthy levels and sustainable levels of dopamine, which again helps with this core, especially in the hippocampus, with supporting memory and cognition, as well as happiness and as well as good sleep. So it was a really fun to see that it had this double hit. Among people who take fatty 15, it's almost like science is catching up to what our customers have been telling us, which is, we have 50% of our customers report feeling better within 2 weeks. And consistently, it's deeper sleep, calmer mood, less joint pain. The same 70% report these benefits within 16 weeks. So we were kind of like in the beginning, that's probably a placebo effect that you're feeling. But then I experienced it myself with deeper sleep. And so now we're realizing the science is catching up and explaining it. And then we can talk about the fun metabolite if you wanted to go the PDC route. It's up to
Just
you.
one question in there. So Parkinson's is a dopamine deficiency
Mhm.
disease.
That's
Have
right.
you thought about um, C15 and Parkinson's?
Yeah, for sure. The potential for C15 to um, help prevent or augment or help with symptoms or slow the progression of neurodegenerative diseases is high on our list. As you know, these clinical trials are difficult. And so it's not on the top of our clinical trials, but we hope that those that are working in this area actively will add C15 to their list. Meanwhile, we continue to track and support, the research to be able to support how much do we need, what are the active concentrations, so that when there is a clinical trial, we can, have the best chance of it helping. But how wonderful would that be to be able to help improve quality of life and even, the potential to slow the progression of neurodegenerative diseases as we age would be amazing.
And just could you quickly explain the difference between like cannabis and endocannabinoids? Why one is potentially problematic and the other is perfectly natural.
Right, exactly. So we have these receptors in our brain and throughout our body, and they're called cannabinoid 1 and cannabinoid 2 receptors. Most of the CB1 receptors are the ones that we have in our brain. I'm generalizing, and the CB2 receptors are in our body. So those receptors respond to, and hence their name, cannabinoids, cannabis, which helps with, again, the decreased joint pain and calmer mood. But while those receptors were discovered because scientists were hunting for how cannabis worked, what we clearly understand is we don't have those receptors for cannabis. So it's not like we evolved to have CB1 and CB2 receptors so that we could find cannabis, even though it's been used by humans for 1,000+ years. But like dogs have CB, and pigs and dolphins have CB receptor, cannabinoid receptors. They're not using cannabis, right? So the question then, once they had discovered these receptors, and this is how cannabis was having its effect, the next question is, well, there have to be cannabinoids molecules that activate these receptors in our body that are intended to use these receptors. And those are called endocannabinoids. So these are the ones, molecules that our bodies use to properly and safely trigger. It's a bit of an off-target mechanism when you take a plant and use it to trigger it. So hence, exactly to your point, Richard, that there's like on target and a little bit off target use of these. So from endocannabinoids, there's only been, prior to our recent discovery, one full acting endocannabinoid. And it is that fully activates CB1 and CB2. And this endocannabinoid which is called AG2, see if I get that right, is made by, it's a metabolite of arachidonic acid, which is an omega-6 fatty acid. So here you have a fatty acid that we ingest, we metabolize it, and it makes the one full acting endocannabinoid that we've known to date. So it becomes less surprising that we then discovered that our body takes C15 to make a second full acting, the second ever discovered full acting endocannabinoid, and it's called pentadecanoyl carnitine. So when we threw which we'll call PDC, when we threw PDC against a bunch of receptors, we were super surprised to see it fully activated CB1 and CB2 receptors and became this big discovery of the second ever discovered fully acting endocannabinoid. And that also helps explain why people are experiencing better sleep, calmer mood, that not only does C15 inhibit enzymes that chew up 2AG. Thank you. So not only do they, I have a helper in the background helping to keep me honest here, Eric. Thank you. Um, but the so not only is C15 helping to inhibit the enzymes that chew up endocannabinoids, C15 is also used to make an endocannabinoid. So, and then if you think about if we took C15 out of our diet and we have declining C15 levels and deficiencies, and we needed C15 to make this PDC, could this help explain again is this deficiency syndrome not only explaining the rise in type 2 diabetes and heart disease, and especially among people born since the 1990s, but is it also feeding some of the mental health crisis that we're seeing? And that latest clinical trial showing that women with metabolic syndrome, right, fatty liver disease, and were overweight, the fact that the ones that supplemented with C15 had the greatest decrease in anxiety supports that this may be the case. Again, a lot of exciting studies ahead.
Yeah, you could see that women will be have improved anxiety because they became slimmer, but also because they're not eating, because their diet is so small, right? It's like 1,000 and something calories. That would increase
Yeah,
anxiety.
yeah. We get the hangry situation going for me. So I would definitely become more stressed. So, and it wasn't that one. That study showed a trend. So they showed, they reported significant levels in p-values, and they showed that the p-value became more and more significant as you moved from that first group of low calorie to low calorie with Mediterranean, low calorie Mediterranean plus C15. You saw the p-value get more and more significant as you got to that third group. So again, interesting and aligned with these other pieces that we're seeing, and again, we get a lot of our customers reporting, I'm feeling calmer, or I have less joint pain. So it's nice when the science pairs up with consistent reports that we're getting anecdotally from our customers.
So another thing that C15 may help with is leaky gut. So help strengthen your gut wall. So can you talk about what you've seen there and what the kind of downstream effects are?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm proud to say this is none of our research. So there have been completely separate independent teams that have been focusing on inflammatory bowel disease and leaky gut syndrome. Leaky gut is also associated with MASLD. And so this is a series of at least three different groups that have looked at five or six different models of leaky gut in rodents. And all of them showed that C15 supplementation helped to restore the gut lining. And they're able to measure that by measuring things in the blood that that work their way into the blood that shouldn't be there if you don't have leaky gut. So certain types of bacterial cell wall markers, for example, the proteins, they can measure the proteins that make up the gap junction between between the epithelial cells. So they use these well accepted measurements of an intact and healthy gut lining to show that C15 significantly improves gut lining. Not only that, but it significantly decreases inflammation at the gut level and improves the healing of the gut tissue. So there's really remarkable images showing in these rodent models that were basically had inflammatory bowel disease and then had inflammatory bowel disease with C15 supplementation. And that supplemented group, the tissue looked exactly like a healthy control. So, really encouraging with regard to knowing what we know that C15 does. And it makes sense, given again this cell strengthening, repairing cell walls, getting that gut lining improved, and decreasing inflammation in the gut. So it's a super exciting frontier because leaky gut is not just a gut issue, it becomes a whole systemic inflammatory issue. So if we can keep our gut lining intact, that helps not just our gut, but our whole body health.
So where can we get C15? So we've definitely talked about this a bit. So full fat milk. Um, so what is the percentage of C15 in full fat milk? Oh, well, we kind of said that it varies, but roughly how
Mhm.
much is it, and what's the rest of the fat?
Yeah, if it's whole fat milk of decent quality, about 1%, about 1% of dairy fat. So a little bit. And so C15 can have a hard time competing with all these other fats. So much higher levels, like I said, of these even chain saturated fats, C14, C16, C18, account for about 40% of the fats in dairy fat. So we can get for sure, by far, our primary source of C15 from food is from dairy fat, even though it's just this tiny amount. This is our best source of C15. Things like pecorino cheese has some of the highest C15 levels. We might have talked about it in the last one, but really fascinating studies showing that if you take a ruminant, right, a animal that makes milk that we drink, if you take that ruminant and you feed it grass, it has more C15. If you feed it grass that was grown at high altitude, they make even more C15 in their milk. So Sardinian cheese, which are goats and sheep that are grazing on grass at a high altitude, that helps explain why pecorino has some of the highest C15 levels, even among dairy fat. So that's a good way to get C15. We know that if we eat fiber, that our bodies, that the inulin in fiber can feed microbes in our gut that then use that inulin. The microbes use inulin to make C15. So our microbes, the microbes in our gut have some C15 making capability, not enough to get us up and over deficiency, but if we can use all these tips and tricks, right? We can really maximize, we can supplement, we can do grass-fed dairy fat, we could eat high fiber foods. And then there's another study that showed that exercise can release C15 from our tissues and raise the C15 levels in our blood. So yet another reason to exercise.
So I think you mentioned some, maybe it was a observational study that showed that increasing C15 led to better health outcomes, for adults anyway, but increasing like dairy did not. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's what we see is when you look at, there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of studies on dairy fat. Most of those studies in humans and looking at health outcomes, most of those studies were biased toward trying to show that eating dairy fat was bad for you. So they weren't trying to say it was good for you. Most of them were kind of unfairly biased toward they're going to be bad for you. What became a surprise is that increasingly, if you looked at the weight of the different studies, in most cases it wasn't good or bad. But the big thing was like, wait, it's not bad for you. So I think we need to better understand. I think that was the first step of like, okay, maybe dairy fat isn't as bad as we thought it was. So this is a huge step for society to adopt and understand. There's really a need to really take the blinders off, really look at the body of data and understand where we're at. I personally think dairy fat for kids is more beneficial than damaging, especially with regard to C15. I'm a veterinarian, so every mammal uses milk at birth and for development. So we should probably pay attention to that. As adults, we're the only species that eats dairy fat beyond being kids. So I think being able to understand, there was a group that met in Denmark to kind of get to the crux of your question, Richard, which is their question is when you have individual nutrients within milk that in isolation do remarkably well, right? C15 is a good example of that. We've talked about all these benefits. But when you mix it back into the whole food matrix of dairy, it loses that efficacy. So that group concluded that milk fat in adults might be the exception to the rule of the best way to get your nutrients is from whole food. That may not be the case entirely for milk. It's not that it may be that we're just learning that milk isn't bad for us. Let's start there. But we can optimize these beneficial individual nutrients by letting them work in isolation and not having to compete with, there are over 400 fatty acids in milk fat. So being able to find the needles in the haystack that are going to be most beneficial, we're finding they do better in isolation.
Yeah. Do you get competitive absorption problems? I mean, if you have
Spot
all
on.
this fat, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So there have been a really interesting mouse study showing that if you give a mouse a high fat diet, which they do all the time because that's how you induce obesity and diabetes in a obese mouse model, you give it a high fat diet to induce these diseases. And so what these studies have shown is that when mice are giving that high fat diet, their C15 levels go down. And this diet has C15 in it. And so, Richard, that gets to your, smart observation and thought, which is if you put C15 in with a bunch of other fats, there is a competitive issue, which is that C15 is just, there are too many other bully fats, and it's just this little tiny 1%, and it just doesn't it's less likely to make its way across the barrier if it's with too many other fats.
So if you did want to supplement, then what would a good protocol be? How often? And so with meal or without?
Right, that's a good question now, right? Because, well, first of all, it was made so C15 supplementation is really intended to supplement our diet, right? So for me, I don't shy away from dairy fats. I love my flat whites, I love my cheeses, and I have my high fiber crackers to go with it to go maximize my C15 levels. I wouldn't be able to achieve because I have a 0.46% C15 level. I know I wouldn't be able to achieve that with just dairy fat alone. So it's truly meant to, and I'm looking to optimize, like I'm getting into the Sardinian, right, levels. That's where I want to be. So, in general, we recommend people take one 100 milligram capsule a day and just start with that and do that for, 3 to 6 weeks and see how they're feeling. We always recommend people get their blood tests before they start and then 3 to 6 months after they've been routinely taking it. We have a 95% monthly retention rate on Body 15, which is remarkable. We've had that since day one. We launched in 2021. So we've had a good, solid number of years behind us. And that retention rate sticks because people are experiencing benefits. And the fact that we recommend with one means that one is getting a lot of people to the right place. If they aren't feeling benefits or they're pushing for things like for me, I took one capsule for a long time and it did great for me. And then menopause kicked in. And all of a sudden, I was dealing with tennis elbow and I don't play tennis and achy hips. And I was like, what's going on? And so I did go up to two and it got rid of my joint pain. So I think it's depends upon what people's needs are for C15. Are you vegan? Then you're probably really low in C15 and you might need more. But we always recommend people start with one. There's no need to take more than what you need to get you to the right place. So you can work up from there. But we're
And
not pill pushers.
right.
It's just like take the minimum amount that you need to get you to where what you're trying to achieve.
And sorry, with or without meal?
Oh yeah, with or without meal. So I take mine with my coffee in the morning, and it does great. I think again because we see such high retention rates, and we're not telling people take it with a meal or without. This was one of the key things we did with this is it's a free fatty acid C15, which means it is readily is 100% bioavailable. So in food, C15 is attached to triacylglycerides, which means that we have to use our digestive enzymes to cleave off that C15, make it a free fatty acid so we could absorb it. So we cut that step out. And so that means that you can take it without a meal. So you don't have to get those digestive enzymes going to absorb it. So you can take it without a meal. And now the question is if you take it with a really high fat meal, is there a chance that that could actually reduce the absorption of it? So just because of these latest studies. So we don't tell people to pick one way or the other because again, our retention is so high. But I take it in the morning with my coffee, which also has milk in it, and and it does great.
Okay, so what are the next steps for C15? What are you kind of working on now?
Yeah, gosh, the movement, right? So there's just too much with the book, the longevity nutrient.
Right?
With the book that came out from Simon and Schuster, um, the intent of the book was really you can't explain C15 away anymore. There's just too much science there. And so there's really a need. And then there's the urgency, right? That if we have C15 deficiencies and they're fixable, like vitamin C deficiency and scurvy and vitamin D deficiency and rickets, deficiencies are readily fixable. And if C15 deficiencies, if even there's a chance that it is driving this alarming rise that we're seeing in chronic aging associated diseases in children, goodness, let's get to work on that. So the next steps are really about, since the beginning, we started with credibility, so building the science around C15, 10 years plus doing that. And it continues. The second is awareness, and so chatting with you, Richard, and being able to get the word out, and then through the book. Of all the science behind C15. And then our last is accessibility. So we just spun out an ingredient business being led by Mr. Bruce Brown, who actually helped bring DHA to infant formulas. And so Bruce is helping us on our global public health mission to help fortify foods to help really make C15 accessible to all. So we're really excited on that next big push to check off the box that we've wanted since the very beginning.
That's wonderful. Are you still working with, I guess, universities or other people in terms of clinical trials? Do people come and request C15 for their trials?
Yeah, so the good news is people can get C15 from research facilities pretty easily. So it's not for routine human consumption, but it could be used for research purposes. So people are able to the researchers have been able to do a lot. The studies have continued without even needing to come to us, which is great. We do have some groups that we're with which we're collaborating. We're really focusing on a few key things like anemia. That this is again something that C15 has reliably had efficacy in strengthening cell membranes against premature breakdown. As we get older, our cells become more fragile, including our red blood cells, and you see an increase in anemia among older and older people, so much so that doctors started calling low hemoglobin levels as normal in older people. And now we know it's like, no, 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 it's not normal. If you have anemia and you're older, you're frail, you're more likely to fall, you're more likely to have longer stays in hospitals, and all of that adds up to a higher mortality rate. So finally, the scientific and medical community is understanding we should not have fragile red blood cells. And so we're really excited about the potential for C15 to help reverse that aging associated issue and be able to keep people healthy and robust and resilient longer. So that's our a big push that we're doing on in collaboration with some teams.
Excellent. So thank you, Dr. Venn-Watson, for coming on the channel again. So where can people go to find more information about C15 and your work, and where can they get the book?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is chock full of science. It shares our discovery story with the dolphins and is a bit like a detective story as we walked through a lot of the things that we talked through here. And it's also basically a reference manual for C15. The index in the back is one of the most helpful components is like, so what does C15 have to do with X, Y, or Z? That index is deep. And so it's an easy way for people to be able to understand the things with which they're interested in. So longevity nutrients available wherever books are sold. So it's a Simon and Schuster book, so Amazon and Barnes and Noble and all other places. And then for this new science, it was heartbreaking to turn in the final edition for the hardcover because, of course, the next 2 weeks later, all these essential fatty acid validating studies came out, and now we have more clinical trials. So paperback is coming out. It does include more, but now it's just the C15 studies are coming so fast and furious that the best place resource for the latest, absolute latest, is discoverc15.com. And that's where all the peer-reviewed studies are put there. And then, of course, fatty15.com to learn more about the supplement and all the story and science behind it.
Okay, Dr. Venn-Watson, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been great talking to you again.
Richard, it's always a pleasure. Great, great talking with you.
Thank you.